welcome to another episode of SaaS Leaders Lounge, and I'm excited to be joined by Maxime Lamothe-Brassard, the founder and CEO of LimaCharlie. Hi, Maxime. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great, thanks.
How's your week been, and any plans to travel this week?
The week's been going very well, very busy, but that's good. It's conference season starting soon, so I'm kind of savoring the days where I can just stay at home, do my own thing, and then the season will start. So I know it's going to be a lot busier.
And are you planning to attend the upcoming conferences in the next couple of weeks or months? I guess the RSA's, DEF CON, etc.
Yeah, that's right. So we've got Google Next, RSA, Black Hat, and I know there's a couple more coming after, and then in October timeframe, there's going to be our own conference, Mission Control.
Nice.
So it's going to be busy.
And is that the first conference that LimaCharlie will host yourselves, or?
So it's the second year that we will do it, we're hosting it in Washington D.C. in the offices actually of one of our investors, Sands Capital. So it's a great location, and it's kind of a different spin on cybersecurity conference. It's really targeting innovation and automation and engineering.
Exciting. And if you don't mind, I'd love for you just to give our audience a bit of an overview of yourself and how it came about that you founded LimaCharlie with some of the co-founders.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I'm Canadian, although I live in the United States these days. So I started in, I've had a computer my whole life. So it was pretty obvious that I would be doing some kind of career in computers. But I ended up doing a bachelor's degree in computer science business option at the University of Victoria. And part of that is a lot of internships. So I think it was like 4 or 5 internships.
Wow.
So I did an intern. I did almost all of my internships at an organization in Canada called the Communication Security Establishment, CSE. That is the equivalent of the NSA or GCHQ or DSD in Australia. So part of the Five Eyes. So in the intelligence, and that was really my first real exposure to cybersecurity. So that was kind of a big, amazing moment for me. And then ever since then, that security is the only thing that I've ever done. So I was there for many years on the signals intelligence side, and then on the defensive side after a while. And then eventually I wanted to go and explore a bit more the private sector, but the rest of the world. So intelligence can be pretty inward looking in many ways. And so I ended up joining a young startup called CrowdStrike. So they obviously are no longer a young startup. But it was a very, very interesting time to be in terms of entrepreneurship, 0 to 100. Really, yeah, that was super cool. Learned a lot, obviously, about especially open source and things that existed out there. Made my way to Google internal security. So worked inside of Google. And then after a while, I heard about Google X, which is the experimental branch. They were doing a moonshot in cybersecurity. So that's what they call them, meaning, it's the thesis of like, hey, imagine that you're a startup, but you're also kind of Google with Google means and access to the technology, and you're going to go do something amazing, right? So I had to join that team. That this kind of really spoke to the kind of personality that I have. So joined that team super early on. Went through kind of an amazing process around trying all kinds of different ideas and all that stuff. And then after, I think it was after just short of 2 years, maybe, that spun out into what became Chronicle Security. And so it became a company for about 6 months and then got bought back by Google Cloud. It's kind of this weird thing. But really, really amazing experience. And then while I was at Google, I open sourced a what we call an EDR in security, so endpoint detection and response. It's essentially it's an agent you deploy on all kinds of computers. So think, CrowdStrike, I don't know, Carbon Black and Sentinel One and all those guys. So when I decided to leave what became Chronicle, it was pretty clear that I wanted to go and start something. I had a pretty valuable piece of technology in my back pocket, EDR, and so I set out to take a big swing and figure out. I didn't want to do something mundane. I wanted to do something that potentially had the chance to really like change a generation of cybersecurity. So yeah, that's kind of how I got there.
That was a bold move, and I definitely agree that having those exposures at Google and at CrowdStrike early in your career, and at one of the intelligence organizations back in Canada, really gave you a various degree of exposure to different things, and enabled you to have valuable lessons along the way to build what become LimaCharlie today. But something I wanted to touch on there, you mentioned something about you wanted to build something that was for the generations. And recently you had, created a post where you talked about this. You didn't want to have a solution that was, just for today, but for the long term. So I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on, how LimaCharlie's product is, game changing in what they're offering, and how the SecOps space is still got a long way to go effectively in terms of being a product that's, mirroring those of other industries.
Absolutely. So fundamentally, right, the cybersecurity industry is growing up a lot in the past decade, right? I always make the same joke, but like 10 years ago, it was the two dudes with hoodies in the basement, right? That like you see in movies. And then over time, nowadays, it's a lot more sophisticated, and I would say we're becoming more of a serious industry. And what I mean by serious is it's not just people throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks and kind of like trying things, but we have the CISO is in the C-suite. We have things like the project Atomic Red Team around let's test our security posture. We have the MITRE framework. Let's reason about all different types of attacks. So we're growing up and looking at the industry. But what I'm finding over, I've been around for a while now in security, is that there's a ton of good stuff that's happening, and that's great. But the industry side, like the vendor side, is stuck, I would say, in the same mode of operation that it has always done it, right? I'm going to start a company that does this really narrow thing. I'm going to get a term from Gartner around that market, and then I'm going to build this thing. There's going to be the hype cycle. I will get sold to a bigger player that puts it under their web portal where all other 150 acquisitions that they've made are. It's all kind of going to look a little bit similar, but it's I'm going to be forced as a customer to buy this big bundle of like a bunch of different services. They're all from different companies. They don't integrate all that well. I'm stuck
Yeah.
in that environment now. You know where I'm going, right? So what I was really saying is there's another path to this, which is a path that's been already done by other people, meaning in IT, right? The cloud providers sort of found that third door, meaning cloud providers, look, they're big. They have a lot of products, right? Like we're not, I'm not saying we don't want any big companies that do a lot of things. It's about how you do those things. And getting very specifically to your point, the how you do those things becomes a question of, are you going to be a net inhibitor of innovation in the industry or a net driver of innovation, right? If you are just this gigantic company, right, with all those opaque products and like you force people in like those big bundles, it's really like all stuck together, but not really designed from the ground up to where you're not making it easier for other people in the industry to come in and build on top of what you've done, right? Build on top of the shoulders of giants, right? Is the expression. Whereas cloud providers found that third door, which is to say, look, we're going to do a lot, and we're going to be pretty big, but fundamentally, we're going to make it possible for
To build
others
on top.
to go faster, stronger, build on top of us, right? Like to be positive, so we have a positive impact on the industry. And so I think that's really what I want to focus on, because as an industry, we've done a bunch of steps towards maturity. There's a lot more that we need to do, and I'm super worried by seeing the current state of this, like 5 vendors that are just swallowing up the world,
Yeah.
and doing it at, in the old school way and not in a, positive way. So I'm thinking.
I agree, and if you can become, the AWS, the GCPs of the world, look at what they've been able to do. A lot of these, big tech companies out there today and unicorns that have become, very successful, have been off the back of being able to deploy easily and securely on AWS or GCP. And as you said, it is a concern that, sometimes you look at some of the traditional old school big vendors, they acquire companies, they kind of consolidate the solution, but they don't, continue to mature it and advance it. So then there's always flaws later down the line in the technology. So you always want people. I know it's common that when they acquire a company, the founders usually come in and they're still tasked with kind of managing and overseeing that product line to make sure that it stays on par with what they want to achieve. But I guess the industry needs to do a little bit more, and I agree on that. In terms of, as we relate that to LimaCharlie, could you share any success stories or case studies where organizations have successfully implemented the SecOps cloud platform that you guys are, selling at the moment, and have been able to really achieve significant improvement in their security operations? Because that's something that potential buyers or people in the industry will want to know about, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yes, and I'll mention a few. The way to think about it is, don't necessarily just focus on kind of individual products, right? I always compare ourselves to AWS in a way, right? AWS, like, is there success stories to AWS? Yes, there's tons of success stories, and a lot of them look wildly different from one another, right? There's stories around managed service providers, using it to provide services to their customers, but there's also stories about, AI startups building products and doing a lot of innovation in a startup. So the spectrum is very large, but some examples would be, we have, for example, a few MSSPs, so managed security service providers, that have started using LimaCharlie, and much like the move to the cloud, right, where it's kind of it's more than just necessarily using one product. I mean, you can use that one product, but there's a value in rethinking how you're doing things. So they've rethought their operations in using this cloud for cybersecurity. And so for them, we end up being the foundation, kind of the underlying fabric of all of the low level things that they do, right? So we removed things, issues or products for them around, data lake. We have EDR products, so endpoint detection and response, an automation engine, the ability to do data optimization going into other data lakes. We have a ton of different integrations with things like open source. So it's really that fundamentally we've been able to reduce the number of vendors that they had. We are aligned with them because we're an infrastructure company. So it's not like historically, they tried to make a deal with, SentinelOne, but SentinelOne also does MDR. So they're kind of in competition with their own vendor, and it's weird. So we're a neutral space. and they've been able to reduce their bills pretty much across the board, right? So like they spent, I think one of the case studies we have is they were spending something like $100,000 a year on a data lake, and they've been able to reduce that like drastically. I forget the exact number, but I think it might be like 50% kind of thing.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that's one type of story, but let me show you a totally different type of story, which is exciting too. There's companies like Blue Mira. So Blue Mira was a cloud SIM type of company. I'm sure I don't quite do it justice, but like at a high level. And they wanted to be able to shape their product and evolve it into a different direction. They wanted to be able to start talking in terms of XDR. So what they did is they came to us, and we had we had the discussion. We showed them what that could look like in LimaCharlie, and they went 0 to GA, so generally available, on that new product. And I think it was about 4 or 5 months. So if you're thinking in terms of entrepreneurship and like the legacy world, right? Like, no, that's a $2 million investment over 2 years building a new product. And is it going to work? Who knows? Whereas they went there in 5 months, pay as they go, like a cloud provider. So it just completely changed the game.
It's definitely groundbreaking. And I guess a lot of companies, especially of bigger sizes, when they are trying to shift from those legacy systems, they are going to want a short term or shorter duration time to make that transition where they're not spending so much money, and they can go live sooner rather than later, because the longer that transition period takes, obviously there's more costs and delays associated with that. So I agree. And in terms of the automation piece, I just wanted to cover that. I know a lot of companies are, looking at ways to automate processes, especially in security. And how is the LimaCharlie automation piece of the product really helping, to propel the offering to customers?
That's a great question. So take half a step back, right? Here's how we think about the products in LimaCharlie. And that's actually a pretty important thing to understand. For us, we target use cases, right? We are people that have done security in the past, so we understand things very well. And we know the delta between, what's the term that Gartner uses for like that whole segment, and what use do people make out of it. And over time that changes, right? That's kind of the whole hype cycle, right? Like tons of companies come in, it's a really hot segment, and then over time people start to understand where's the value really in that type of product. Okay, we understand that the number of company goes down, eventually it becomes boring. Like EDR is sort of one of those. Everybody, I say EDR to a security professional, they know 80% of what I'm talking about. So eventually people go like, you know what? I know where the value in a firewall is. I don't need a company to, brand it and do
Differently.
the whole thing. So we target very specifically that segment, meaning we want to encourage innovation. We want to encourage people building on top of us. So we're not really targeting, the very front of the hype cycle, the cutting edge stuff where like, what's going to be happening. Instead, what we do is we look at the things that are well understood, that are just they're not they shouldn't be a company anymore. They should be a feature, really. And we look at where the true value lies in this, and that's what we build. So around automation is a great example. Are we, an automation product like quite as cutting edge as like Tynes is a great example. Tynes is amazing, right? And we work with them all the time, like amazing people. We don't we don't reach that. So we focus on the hard lower level kind of bits of that, meaning, hey, I've got Office 365 and I have, a ton of telemetry coming in, or maybe I've got, 50,000, Mac hosts coming in, and I want to look for very specific combinations at very high speed. And when this and that happens, I want to be able to customize and send that to, to pager duty, or to go and take this action against that resource, or do like, these types of things. So that is how we target things, not so much at the higher level of like, hey, here's a big playbook, visually, and like, that kind of thing. So we tend to really focus on the really hard, lower level, high throughput bits for example, automation, because we want to be the pipes under it all, right? We want to take those big problems and remove them for people.
I love the analogy, and thanks for breaking that down. And recently, you discussed the implications of different billing models in MSSPs and MDR businesses. Can you elaborate a little bit on this and maybe share some insights on some effective billing strategies for today and in the future in cybersecurity? Because I know SaaS obviously came out and it was big, subscription model, etc. But now with an economy that we face, how can we really shift that to make the customers better off in the long term and feel that the ROI is clearly there?
Yeah, totally. So we work with a lot of MSSPs, right? Not that we're not an MSSP product, but just,
Of course,
it's like AWS,
naturally.
right? Like, people that do a lot of things for other people love it. And we've observed a few different patterns in how they do billing for their customers. And my worldview of this is kind of combining what we've observed and where the industry's going, and as a whole. So maybe I'll just start very briefly by that side of the equation. But what we're seeing is it's really hard to hire good people in security, right? Like there's a shortage of people in
Shortage.
cybersecurity,
Yeah.
just how it is. It's not going to change. There's more and more IT, more and more complexity. Everybody wants a silver bullet, but it's not going to happen. So what will end up happening is that if you kind of look at the spectrum of companies worldwide that need some kind of cybersecurity capabilities or help, right now it's kind of even, meaning there's a lot of small companies that also try to hire a security person to go and help them, and then on the other end there's a lot of really, really big companies doing amazing. Over time, the small companies just will not be able to hire and retain those security people. Fundamentally, I would say they shouldn't, right? That's not where they're adding value. If you run a lumber yard somewhere, do you want a cybersecurity person? Why? That's not your thing. So what's going to be happening is bigger companies will have more and more to have their own people doing cybersecurity, because they're going to have pretty unique environments, unique needs, right? It's not all the same. Small companies will have to move towards MSSPs. So I mean that in a really wide range, right? People that do security for others. So if that's the direction things are going, then you look at the billing methods for MSSPs. Some of them will aim to pass line items to their customers, right? The way that they look at this, they say, look, I'm going to do these services for my customer, and here's the products I'm going to buy or I want to have available in my roster, right? And I'm going to show those prices to the customer. The customer is going to pick and choose which of those products. I'm going to take the cost of that line item and I'm going to pass it on to the next one. And that's about it. So that's one way of doing things. The other way is, instead of saying, look, I will be performing services to the customer, those services are not the tools. Nobody cares about the tools. It's the outcome that matters. And so as a serious security company, right, what I'm going to sell is the outcome. And that means that the way I bill my customer is based on that outcome and not on a list of tools. And the critical difference there is that it enables the MSSP to start thinking differently about their operations. Whereas in the past, the customer is choosing every single product, it means as an MSSP, you have to support each of those individual products. It means that over time, with enough customers, you're supporting a ton of different products. in different ways. Your analysts need to understand all of those. The integrations need to work across the board. It's very complex. Whereas if you're selling the outcome, now what you can do is you can say, what is the stack of products that allows me to deliver that outcome the most efficiently possible? And when you look at it that way, you can find a ton of optimizations that wouldn't be available to you if you had to support these 50 products in 50 different categories. Now you can look at it holistically and say, you know what, if I focus on these 2 products, I can cover these 10 different use cases that I deliver for my customers. And so I reduced it. I reduced the vendor and like the overhead. I probably optimized my cost based on that scale. It's a lot easier for me to automate off of it. So there's a ton of benefits that come out of that. But the important part is you have to start thinking differently about how you do that billing, which sounds like how you do billing is not exactly like hot, but it has so many implications that
Of
are
course.
really, really important.
And would you say it took a while for you in the early days to really uncover how to really price the offering and to make sure that all of the different aspects were met to make sure that the business were able to be profitable, but also for the customers to get it at a rate that was, feasible in the long term if they needed it, as you mentioned with the other use case, 5 or 6 month, legacy shift over, it was, sustainable, the cost in that respect.
So you see, for us, the challenge was not so much on kind of getting to that price point, I would describe it, but really it was how to structure the billing, our own billing. Here's what I mean specifically. A lot of people, particularly in security, are used to this kind of scenario of, hey, I'm going to send an email to that vendor. After a week, I'll get a call back. I'm going to spend the next month negotiating a 3-year contract that have a specific, quantity of things available, like licenses in there. And now that's what I've got. And so there was a lot of folks that were just a lot more comfortable on that side of like how to do billing. And so what they were looking for was, give me the number that I'm going to pay. And that's what I'm going to pay, kind of regardless, more or less, of what I end up doing, right? Like they just want that one number. And that's totally fair, like totally understandable. But the other end of the spectrum is, I talk about the cloud all the time. We model ourselves in the cloud. That is not at all how a cloud works, right? Fundamentally, a cloud works where here's the metrics that we're going to use that you will be billed on. You're not going to be billed on anything else than the exact usage that you make out of it. So there's a big gap between those 2 ways of doing billing. And what we found back in the day when we started a couple of years back is vast majority of people were on the side of like, just give me that one number. But what's super cool is over time, so we never fully optimized on that side. We always kind of kept the ability to do true cloud billing, and that has paid off because now we find that most people that come to us understand what the cloud is, right? And they're used to this idea of like, yeah, the cloud, I pay for what I use. That's the thing I want. And so most of them now preferred that side of the billing. So we support both, and we really truly had to support both in order to get here. But it's also, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to try to make things make sense in both kind of billing modes.
I agree, and even as you said, from a cloud perspective, even myself, I enjoy paying for what you use and knowing, okay, you have a limit. Okay, up to this point, you pay this much. Going to the next level, you go over this usage, you pay that much. It's very clear, you know what you're getting, and you can kind of agree on it from the beginning, right? And something I wanted to just take a bit of a detour on was just the team. Of course, LimaCharlie isn't something that could just be successful by yourself, and I always love for leaders and founders to shout out their team. So I just wanted to understand how important it was for Gio and Christopher and even down to the CRO that you've brought in, how important it was to have these, important pieces of the team to help the business to grow and to get to where it is today.
Yeah. So you see, I think here's my interpretation of this, right? There is no such thing as a startup, like, as like, that's the thing. It's an evolution, and that things are very important in very different ways through that evolution. So if I think back on, early days, right, it was super important in my mind to start a company, right, from zero with other people, so with my co-founders. And that is because and that was a piece of advice somebody once told me. You're going to have bad days, and when you have those bad days, it doesn't mean that you have to be there 100%, pushing 100% of the time, because if you've got somebody else with you, those days they can pick it up, and you can support each other, right, through the early days, which are a lot of sleepless nights and hard work and no weekends, right? The other part of that, I think, was having people that are very complementary to myself. So my background is cybersecurity and engineering. So Chris, for example, my co-founder, his background was early stage companies, and we kind of had a running joke back in the day that Chris knows a guy. So Chris has this ability to just get in touch with people and talk and really connect and make great relationships. And so early on, what actually happened is that we would start growing slowly, and then, hey, we need somebody that can help, like, just help us add structure into the company, into like what we're doing, right? We're starting to look at compliance and like in hiring and finance. And so Chris knew a guy. So Chris knew Amric, who's now our COO. And Amric joined us super early on. And so I think if we had not had this, like, Chris knows a guy, looking back, there's a bunch of hires of super critical people that we would not have brought in. We just wouldn't have known. And then over time, I think what kind of transformed for a while, which was super cool, is it became not so much a question of, like, hey, I know a guy, but rather it became putting the vision into the world of like, hey, we're doing this thing, we're building this thing, here's why it's interesting. And then we would get people reaching out to us that would be, that would say like, hey, I'm looking for something different, and this is really cool, right? Like, this is super interesting. I want to be part of that. And that is so valuable compared to, hey, I'm going to put it on LinkedIn, get 500 resumes, kind of go through it and decide to pick. So like, that in that middle phase, that was like awesome.
I guess it's a breath of fresh air, as you mentioned, and what you mentioned there, when somebody sees something that's truly different very early on, where you're still finding the ground with the companies, it's nice to hear those professionals in the space that have been around for a while saying, look, this is something I want to be involved in. So you're onto something great, and with the right culture and the right people in the team, you're only on an upward trajectory.
Exactly. It helps to have people that end up having the same kind of passion that you have for it, right? That makes a big difference in driving things forward.
And as we talk about the landscape of cybersecurity, as you mentioned earlier on, and as we all know, over days and months, it changes continuously. How do you see this evolving, and the role of SecOps specifically, and what will be the challenges that you can foresee?
Yeah. So I mean, it goes back a lot to the vision, and what that means is I'm going to describe what I hope it gets like, right? So my hope for the industry is that we keep on the path of maturity, meaning like, hey, like I sometimes compare it to I think I'm going to guess structural engineers that build bridges, right? They don't wing it. there's equations that have been built over decades and decades, and there's accidents that have resulted in changes to best practices, and it's a serious thing. And so I hope that cybersecurity manages to go in that direction where it's really nicely structured and honest with itself. Obviously, I hope that we can keep the passion, because that's one of the big differentiators in cybersecurity. A lot of passionate people in that industry. So I want to be able to keep both. And then for LimaCharlie specifically, the world that I want us to get to is the world where we replicate the wins that IT has had with cloud provider. Meaning that IT found that third door, right? That other possibility between a lot of fragmentation and a lot of consolidation, and it's a lot of consolidation, but for the better of the industry. And so I hope that we obviously become that, but I hope there's others joining us, right? I would hope to see other companies starting up and saying, you know what, that makes sense. We also want to build that, and that we end up in an industry where there's several of those, and that accelerates the innovation of all people in cybersecurity. And so I think that's kind of the big focus for me in what I want to see in the industry and for LimaCharlie in the future.
And I'm confident that what you guys are building there is groundbreaking, and it will, something somebody once said to me is great people and great founders, they create something, right? And people love it so much they want to mirror it and try to make it better in their own way, in their own sense of understanding. So I'm confident there will be other SecOps platforms down the line that will try to do something similar but in a different way. But the key to what you're saying really here is, being able to enable generations to have those tools that put them in the driving seat and are able to continuously enhance the security of the nations around the world and the businesses, as we've seen over time now with all of these incidents. Every company, they don't need to be software companies, they all have some element of security that they need to focus on. So it will be something, I think, over time SecOps will become more important. And is there any best practices that you already are seeing or would like to see put in place very early on within the SecOps space?
Yes, and to add just a tiny bit to like the previous question, I'd say, I know that the world I'm describing isn't the world that is there today, right? Like there, it's really different. I think what's important to realize is that there was no cloud providers in IT for many, many decades. And then there was, and then we would never go back. So, that's how I think about it. And that's why, sometimes it's challenging and we're talking to people and trying to explain, and it's not obvious, right? If you went back to 1995 and explained the cloud, no way. But once you kind of get it and we move in that direction, it becomes obvious. So to your question in terms of best practices, I think one of the best evolutions in cybersecurity has been what's usually referred to as detection engineering. And it's this idea of saying, as a company, we will build detections for the things that we know should not be there, right, in our network or that are anomalies. And it's not just about the building it, it's really about the whole life cycle of I will build it, I will test it, right? Build tests for it. And then that is going to get tested continuously over time. And it's taking the DevOps lessons around, CI/CD pipelines, so continuous integration and deployment pipelines, and bringing that to detection engineering. So I think that is an amazing way to move forward, because it means you're not only firefighting and just throwing things into the pile of detections, and then it becomes expensive to try to understand, is it good, is it bad, how much does it take to run? you're kind of always in that loop of reevaluating how things are, confirming that they're working, right? You're not just relying on like, well, that vendor told me they protect me against X. I guess that's true. Like that is not a great answer.
I agree. And just a last of your predictions. What would you say as a whole, cybersecurity? Where do you see it going, and how do you foresee LimaCharlie contributing in the long term to the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, to the industry as a whole is I want to get to the point someday where there's a company that does something completely revolutionary in the industry, uh, and that I find out after the fact that they're built on top of LimaCharlie. I think for me that's sort of like the ultimate, because I want to see people build amazing things, and I think that relationship of like, oh yeah, by the way, it's built on top of LimaCharlie, just like AWS, like that to me is like the sweet spot of like, yep, that's how it is. We enabled you, but we're not, we're not like replacing you. Like, you are adding that value. We're just here to help. That's how I think.
Just the foundation, but the credit belongs to those revolutionaries that will take the next step. I appreciate that approach there and that candidness. And just a question I like to ask all of our guests on the show is, what would be some of the biggest lessons that you've learned in your career, whether that be early on when you was in the intelligence agency down to your time at Google and even founding LimaCharlie?
Oh boy, that's a big one. Um, Obviously, there's been many, but I think one that I learned pretty early on, which is probably very relevant to anybody listening who's thinking of starting something. So LimaCharlie in the very early days, while I was at Google, was for a while an open source project. So an open source EDR. I was just an EDR at the time. And so I open sourced this, right? A lot of effort, a lot of value. It's a like pretty significant technology. And what I found was that even with the best product, with the best ideas, not that LimaCharlie is the best product. I just mean generally speaking, right? Like with the with even with very valuable contribution, even in the open source, where you can say it's free. The reality is there's so many people doing so many things out there that as engineers, as entrepreneurs, as much as we love kind of this idea of like, hey, I made this amazing thing, and then all of a sudden a ton of people come in and want to use it and like, leverage it, and then it explodes. The reality is, even when you give it out for free, you have to do just as much, marketing and reaching out and enhancing the product based on feedback, right? It's there's a lot of effort that's there. And so if you put something into the world and, nothing necessarily happens, that doesn't mean anything. Everything you could do the best thing ever. You still need to go and put in the rest of the work behind it.
That's interesting. You mentioned I was speaking to a friend of mine actually in the States today, and he was talking about a side project where he's actually looking to launch kind of a help desk solution, AI driven, of course. And he was saying, look, right now we're just through the pilot phase, we're just giving it out for people to test. All we're looking for is feedback. And as you said, that's what it is. You're marketing it, but in a way where you're just trying to get feedback to see and identify the ICP, make sure that you're really resonating with the audience, that there's no, product failures as such or feature issues. And then you can start to build on top of that. So it is something of one of the hardest things. And if you are somebody from an engineering background or product background, you maybe don't have that marketing background and that network as such to beyond your friends and colleagues and those immediate network people that you have there. So then you have to, kind of bring in those skills to enable you to see how far the product can reach and if it has legs in the long run. But how was you able to kind of market it from the perspective of LimaCharlie in the early days?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like I've gone the hard way at pretty much everything in my career. That's just my personality. I'm kind of one of those people that, um, I'll hear advice from somebody and understand and be like, yeah, you're probably right. But until I go and I live it and I work through it. It's not truly internalized. So I in the early days, it was a lot of having latching on to people that were interested. So it's not so much that I did a ton of like marketing, but there were a few people that would come in and go like, "Oh, that's a cool project," and I could have stayed kind of detached and go like, "Oh yeah, it is like if you use it if you want." But I think getting into that engagement of like, "Yeah, you're right. Like, did you try it? What did you think? Oh, you hit this problem. Let me go and do and work it out for you. And how's it now, right?" Those early people that we engaged became great partners in enhancing the product, and then they would talk about it out there. And in a world where there's so many big companies that you can file a ticket and maybe you'll hear about it a year from now, when you get to work, to interact with a product in a company where you can talk to the person building it and go through that life cycle, for a lot of people, that's a big deal. So leveraging that.
I agree. I think a feedback loop is important in the early days, and especially if you have people in the industry that are championing what you're doing and the products, people are going to listen and resonate to those that they trust and know within their network, right? Rather than somebody that has never been in cybersecurity saying, "Oh, that's a cool product, but I don't really understand how it works," so they can't really take their word for it. And just as we wrap up, I just want to ask you a few quick fire questions, and then I will ask you a question from our last guest. So to start off the quickfire questions, would you rather have a photographic memory or the ability to forget anything you want?
Oh, photographic memory.
I think I would
Oh,
too.
yeah.
And would you rather live in a world with no internet or no air conditioning?
That is like that's an interesting one. I think I'm very torn, but I would say I would rather live in a world that has no air conditioning, because as as difficult sometimes it is to live with the internet nowadays and kind of a constant aspect of it. If we're honest with ourselves, there's so many good things that have come out of that I think we have to go and do that.
And it depends where you live. If you're somewhere cold, you're not really that bothered about the aircon, right? So I
That's
guess
true.
you can move location, but without internet, you're a bit jammed there. And if you could learn any language, what language would that be?
Hmm. Any language? That's a really interesting question too. I think it would probably be German for some reason. It just feels like an interesting language that is like it's pretty big. It's not like super niche. It's not completely different than where I am, and I feel like someday I'll be traveling somewhere, and it's going to become very useful.
Definitely, German is something I started to learn probably to an intermediate level, but given it's a massive market as well, and there's so many tech companies based out of Germany, I definitely think it would be, if you do have a chance and time to learn it, I'm sure it will be something that you'll get around to the person that you are. And just two more quick fire questions. One would be, what is your favorite meal, whether that be a takeout or a meal that you would prep at home when you do have time in your busy schedule?
Think so. It's a thing I don't get to eat very often anymore. Sadly, I would never get to making it myself. But so I'm from Quebec originally, right? So the French Canadian, and there's a meal in Quebec that's called poutine. So it's fries, cheese curds, and gravy. But there's a variation of it, which is instead of gravy, it's oh my god, I'm losing the word. I'm losing my English. It's curry. So it's a curry instead of the gravy, and that mix of like there's some spice to it, and then like the fries and the curry is amazing.
They have something similar like that in the UK. We do it, but it probably won't be as nice. So I'll try it if I do get to Canada one day. And just the last question here before I share the question from our last guest, which is, what is one thing that always makes you laugh or smile?
Uh, Dogs. Always it's dogs. I can't help but walk by a dog and just smile. There's I I love their how they're always in a moment, always just full of love and positive. So it's just stocks.
I can always pick you up after a bad day.
Yeah.
And the question I have from our last guest is actually somebody within the security space, leading up a sales department within one of those organizations. And their question is, how is your organization preparing for the AI boom?
That's interesting. I would preface this by saying, um, like every major technology that revolutionized, that completely changed the game in some way, I think nobody truly has any idea of what that's going to look like. I'm kind of one of those that thinks, for example, we have to go and let the tech evolve, and we're going to hit problems, and then maybe it's going to be legislation, maybe it's going to be in private sector, but we'll have to work through those problems. But for me, sitting right now and just looking at like, hey, what are the problems going to be in AI? Like 100% wrong all the time. I'm convinced. So, so how we're preparing is in a way by not closing doors. So what that means is we're building a cloud, and part of building a cloud means that it's easy to take things that you have in this cloud and shape them and ingest them into other things. So what kind of AI models will we be using for what kind of product? I have no idea. I think we're incredibly early on. We could build a ton of different things that probably all going to be wrong. But by keeping in mind that it will be a hard requirement for us at some point to go and say like, hey, it's been 5 years since the AI revolution was here. It's now clear that this is where the value, like this is where what's important for us to be able to act on that. So I think it's a lot about like just thinking in terms of the fundamental mechanic and mechanism behind it, and not necessarily what the product is.
It's great. It's great to see your open mind approach, and I'm sure that your company, along with many others, will in some way see the trends and start to implement and embed it into some of your solutions for the better over time. And just before I let you go, Maxime, I would love just to ask you to share with us a question for the next guest.
Yeah. So, in what way would you like to leave a better industry for that next generation? Right. I think every industry has an opportunity to make a change for the next generation of practitioners and people that come through it. So what is that thing that you want to help fundamentally change for that next generation?
Great question. I'll be sure to ask. It's another co-founder coming up, and I'm sure he's going to have some good ideas. So I'll be sure to
Awesome.
ask that question, and I hope that you tune in to hear his answer too. But before I
For
let
sure.
you go, Maxime, for anyone listening that may be interested in LimaCharlie or your products, when is the actual event that you're hosting later on this year? Where can they register? And if they want to get in touch with you and the team, what's the best method?
Yeah. So we're at LimaCharlie.io. We have a Slack channel, slack.limacharlie.io. So we do, we're very present there. In the next year, so I think I mentioned it. We're going to be at a bunch of different conferences. We have not announced yet the call for papers and registration for Mission Control, but that is at mssnctrl.org, and that will be coming up a little bit later this year. Just like keep watching that website and LimaCharlie.io what we're doing, and you'll be able to register.
And I recommend everyone interested in SecOps or the future of it to keep following LimaCharlie, seeing what they're doing, revolutionary in the space. And if there's any questions you have, I'm sure Maxime or any of the team will be happy to answer those questions on the Slack channel or anywhere else. But for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. Maxime, I want to thank you for joining us. It's been a great pleasure having you here, sharing your insights, and more importantly, sharing what you think the future will hold for the security industry.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Great chat.
Thank you. Bye bye.